Good afternoon. Today is Friday, May 20th, 2022. We're at the home of our parents, Charles and Margaret Fairhurst, in South St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm Charles Fairhurst, CEO of ITASCA International Incorporated, and I'm here with my sister Margaret Fairhurst-Sternberger. We'll be interviewing our father for the oral history of AIME about his long career in mining, rock mechanics, and rock engineering.
We were asked by AIME to interview our father because I am the chair of the Southern Minnesota subsection of SME, and my brother Charles, as he mentioned, is the CEO of ITASCA International.
So to start with, Dad, could you share with us what role AIME has played in your career?
Yes, I can think of two things directly that are quite important. In 1972, AIME and ASCE together decided that there was a mutual interest in subsurface developments, and so they established a joint committee, which is called the Underground Construction Research, Council. And it was composed of mining engineers and civil engineers with a common interest in how to develop subsurface space, for mining and civil engineering applications. I was asked at the time as a young professor at the university to help with some difficulties on what we called at the time the the Straight Creek Tunnel, now known as the Eisenhower Tunnel, which takes I-70 under the Great Divide in Colorado. They were trying to develop a 50-foot diameter tunnel, full face. It was the whole excavation at once, and got into some considerable trouble. In fact, the governor, I think, of Denver said, "The mountain is on the move." I didn't know how they were going to stop it.
Yeah, and I recall that you brought David and me there with you on a visit once when we were little kids.
Yes, you went skiing while we were doing the other work. And in fact, you got to be able to walk through a pilot tunnel from one side where all the water flowed to the Atlantic, and then the other side, all the water flowed to the Pacific, United States. But during that period, I met a number of very interesting civil engineers, and they asked me if I would be willing to join this Underground Construction Research Council. There was a report put out in 1972, the very first thing they did, by Baker and a number of other groups. And I know that they had projected that there would be an annual savings in the United States of somewhere of the order of $70 to $80 billion every year for underground space development. Today, in today's dollars, that's about $400 billion per year saving by proper use of the subsurface. And if you think today, with all of the infrastructure developments, global warming, etc., I think if they redid that study today, they'd find even greater use. I mean, it's amazing how many of these environmental effects of downed power lines, earthquakes, and temperature changes, all of these things associated with climate change, they're all very superficial. They don't go much below the surface. And all you have to do is to go 10, 50 meters below the surface, and many of the benefits that UCRC identified are realized then. So later I became chairman of UCRC, and we found that we needed a journal to advertise what we're doing. And so I then, for my sins, became the editor of Underground Space. And that's my first contact with Maxwell of Pergamon Press, because he was looking for innovative ideas and founded his own company on that. So that was that. This has later now been taken into, for example, the Rapid Excavation and Tunneling Conference, and it has Rapid Excavation and Underground Space in the title. That's where all that started. The second thing is that in mid-1960s, AIME established the Rock Mechanics Award, and it was given internationally. You didn't have to be a member of AIME or any of the mining groups in the US, or given internationally to the best people in any field that were contributing to rock mechanics. And the first two awards were given to two members of the Bureau of Mines, Leonard Obert and Wilbur Duval, who had actually been the only people I know doing rock mechanics work before World War II. But it was a very distinguished group of people on it. Several of the people who became president of the board, ISRM, and I was happy and very surprised when I received that award several years later. So that was the second one. And now, although it's not a direct benefit to me really, I would urge AIME, particularly with the fact that the petroleum engineers have developed a remote extraction technology, and you can see that the petroleum technologies are in fact now being applied for things like geothermal energy, for hydrofracking and so on, and many minerals will have to be extracted in the future by remote procedures. The mining community has not done an awful lot with this. Some of this may have to be chemical extraction, so the metallurgists and people like that can contribute too. So how are we going to get minerals out of the ground in the future? We've had a big surface excavation procedures, then underground procedures. Now, remote procedures are now being used, but that's remote mining. But remote extraction from boreholes is the third development, and petroleums are very well placed to help us understand and develop them. Before getting into too much detail, I would like to make a comment about something I observed when trying to look over my career. And that is the remarkable ability, or remarkable serendipitous effects that seem to happen. And let me try to summarize them for you very quickly. I came here in June 1956 and found that, unknown to me, Professor Pfleider, who had asked me to start developing rock mechanics, had invited a professor from England to come for 3 months. And he was a professor in coal mining rock mechanics from Newcastle, Professor Potts. He arrived here at the time of the Suez oil crisis, when fuel was rationed in England. And we decided that we would drive from Minnesota to Denver for the conference. And he loved to drive fast, and he had frustrated that he hadn't had the fuel for his car in England. So it was quite a journey from Minneapolis to Denver along roads, and I won't tell you how fast the car was going at the time, but we became good friends en route. then he went back to England, but we stayed friends and so on. Then, a couple of years later, I was in charge of the 5th symposium on rock mechanics and noticed in the papers, there was a paper from a person, Neville Cook, called The Seismic Location of Rock Bursts. I immediately recognized that this was an exceptional piece of work. And I was thinking at the time to go on sabbatical leave to England. And as I was wondering who I could get to replace me to teach the students, I tried to contact Neville Cook. Unfortunately, he didn't attend the conference. He wasn't able to come, but we had a long telephone discussion. And at the time, that was a very expensive proposition to call from the US to South Africa, but it was worthwhile. Anyway, he agreed to come and spend a year at Minnesota whilst I took the family to England on a sabbatical leave to work with Dr. Berry at Nottingham University, and also to get the family acquainted with the English side of a lot of people had not met my wife, nor the children, etc. So that was part and parcel. But Neville came, he stayed for a year while I was gone. And then I got back and we overlapped for a couple of months. But he, at the tender age of 26, was offered the job of directing a new rock mechanics lab in Johannesburg to deal with the rock burst problem. He invited me back to South Africa, and there I met Everett Hook, who was working at the CSIR in Johannesburg and was a mechanical engineer, but he developed into a first-rate first-rate rock mechanics person. And Professor Potts invited me back to England, and when I was there, I met this man, Schalleman, Miklos Schalleman, who was a PhD student. He had been a leader of the Hungarian uprising against the Russian invasion and was targeted by the Russians and was under a death sentence because he was a student leader. So he, his wife, and their young son, who, by the way, later became director of BHP Billington, the biggest mining company in the world, he was recruited, Miklos was recruited to finish a PhD at Newcastle, where Professor Potts was. So I went there, and unfortunately, Professor Potts, on the day I went there, had another appointment. But Miklos Schalleman said, Professor Potts insists that I take you to dinner. So I met Miklos that way. 1 year later, Everett Hook, that I had met in South Africa, was invited to lead the group in Imperial College. So obviously, when I went to London, I went and chatted with Everett and also his students. And it was there that I met one of the students, Peter Condell, and it was obvious to me that Peter was just brilliant, and the way in which he was attacking rock mechanics problems with his so-called distinct element method was far superior to anything else that I saw. And so I was able to talk him into coming to Minnesota. That small group of Cook, Hook, Schalleman, and one or two others. In with Cook came a professor of geophysics who had been at Cambridge, John Jager, and they together wrote a book. But all of them, plus a few others, came back more or less every summer to Minnesota to help me put on a short course up at St. John's Abbey in Collegeville. And it attracted many of the practicing engineers from the civil engineering community and mining engineering community, and really put Minnesota on the map. So I say, there was one other part of it that is not connected with that small group. But when I went to the third symposium of rock mechanics, I heard Dr. Müller, Leopold Müller from Salzburg, give a talk called The European Approach to Slope Stability. And I think he was over here actually also as a consultant to Kennecott Copper Corporation, who were having concerns about steepening the slopes of their open pits. And I remember at the time they said every 1 degree angle increase in slope saves us $1 or $2 million. So they were very concerned about how much they could do that. Well, I heard Professor Müller talk, and then I got into conversation with him afterwards. And he proved to be very affable, and he agreed to come back and spend several days with me at the University of Minnesota talking about how rock mechanics should be developed. He had established a group in Salzburg in 1951. It's the oldest one that had the conference now. I think it's the 72nd. It's been 72 years since 51 or something, or will be in 2023. And he has held that every year. It was called the Salzburger Kreis, or Salzburg Circle. And he invited me to join it. I was the first non-native German person, both Austrians and Germans. I could speak German, but it was not my native language. And a couple of years after I went there, he moved forward to establishing that group as the founding group for the International Society for Rock Mechanics in 1962. He had been a consultant on some big projects where major failures, like 2 dam failures had occurred, and he was a person, he said, people in rock mechanics, people in civil engineering and in mining engineering do not understand how to deal with large-scale fractures and faults, and we've got to have an international society to deal with it. So he asked me then to be co-editor with him on the journal, and we brought Minnesota again into the limelight, but through a chance discussion at a symposium and getting him to come to Minnesota. There are probably others, but throughout, I have been amazed at how just some chance encounters affect a person's careers. Now, it's interesting that to me, though, how I have to say that was in the formative years of the whole discipline of rock mechanics, and there were just a few people internationally involved. But bit by bit, that group expanded, and Minnesota was certainly able to profit internationally from that whole, what I call, series of serendipitous encounters.
Dad, you grew up in Widnes in the northwest of England.
Mm-hmm.
Please share with us what your childhood was like, your parents, your sibling, your family life.
Well, first, let me say that Widnes was the headquarters of the Imperial Chemical Industries. Heavy sulfuric acid, all kinds of very heavy and not very nice things were being made. My brother said once that if you had anything wrong with you, all you had to do was to go walk down against a wall and lick your finger and slide across. And he said it would cure any disease, all of the chemicals that were on the side of the walls. You can leave that out if you like. But my parents My father was a coal miner. The coal mining region was actually north by about an hour's ride on a bicycle. There weren't many cars at the time. But it was a very distinctly separate community, mining. And my mother's family came from a group of people who were sort of tradesmen, civil servants, etc. Not very high level, but they had a sense of pride. Class structure was amazing. Even small differences. If you were a laborer, you were down at the bottom. If you had a desk job, you were somewhat higher, etc., etc. But at any rate, my mother and father married. My mother was from a staunchly Catholic family of Irish people. And my father was the only son of a miner and his wife who had worked on the surface of mines, separating coal from slate and so on. They called them brow girls. So they came from a mining community, and he was a member of what they call the Orange Lodge. You won't know that too much, but it was King William of Orange who was the person who invaded Ireland to put down the Catholics and establish Protestant regime. And that has led to everything right up to the fighting with the IRA and so on. So it was a very visceral opposition to Catholics. When we went into my grandparents' home, over the door was a very large picture of King William of Orange crossing the Boyne to show how he conquered the Irish. So it was a difficult time. However, my mother and father were very much in love with each other and kept the two societies separate. So we grew up, even though my father and I, not knowing very much about mining. And my father had given his parent, certainly his father, the ultimate insult because he had converted to Catholicism, and so he was almost banned from the house. But a side story, later he got quite sick, my father, and he had to go into hospital for about 3 years. And at one time they said it was tuberculosis, but I think this working as a boy from the age of 12 on in the mines had really had a bad effect on his health. But he joked with my mother, saying, "I'm probably the only Catholic ever to have been paid to get well again by the Orange Lodge, because his insurance for medical insurance was through the Orange Club." So anyway, but my parents had been married. It was 1929. I was born in August they were married in 28. I was born in August 1929. It was right at the end of the Roaring Twenties. And 3 months after I was born, there was a great Wall Street collapse. And it was a collapse that spread globally. There was massive unemployment in the US and in England and so on. And then my father became ill, and he'd had a good job in mining. It was well paid. But my mother had to move to a smaller house in the countryside. And there were 4 children and my mother. There was no hot water, it was cold water, outdoor toilets, etc., etc. But it was very, very tough struggle during the Big Depression. But to us as children, there were 4 of us, 3 boys and a girl. It was wonderful because we were in the farmland and the farmers allowed us to go out and help bring in the cattle, etc. And to us it was just heaven. But then my father came back. I was in the local village school, and as were my two brothers, and my sister wasn't old enough, but we went to school there. And it was a two-teacher school with 40 students, 20 each, from the age of 5 to 14. And one teacher took them from 5 to 9, and the other from 9 to 14. And individually, because not quite, maybe there were 2 or 3 of the same age, but had to teach each one different parts of a curriculum. And had 2 wonderful teachers, the headmistress, Miss Mooney, took a particular interest in me because she said, I think you have some special talent. And so she said, I'm going to put you into the exam, the so-called 11+ exam, and that determined whether you were allowed to go to a so-called grammar school or whether you continued in that school and just went to work after 14 and go to what they called a secondary modern school, where they prepared you for trades and so on. But if you got through the 11+ exam, you went to this grammar school, which prepared you for university. So she took me home at night and made me solve mathematics problems, etc., in her front room. She lived there with her sister, both spinsters, dedicated teachers. Well, eventually I got through, I passed the exam, and I was allowed to select any school to go to, but the nearest, and interestingly, there were Catholic schools and there were Protestant schools. And my mother said the local Protestant school, she felt, had a far better standard than the local Catholic school. So she said, your religion will not keep you. You go to the better school. And that was probably the high point of my education, because it was a 5-year high school. It was actually 2 schools in one. You went through the front door. If you turned to the right, it was the girls' school. If you turned to the left, it was the boys' school. The boys' school emphasized the sciences. The girls' school emphasized the arts. So for the first 5 years, we studied a lot of subjects, and there were very good sports teams. Playing rugby, I played rugby. But the teachers were absolutely dedicated and top flight, sometimes very tough. But it's the highest standard of education for my age that I've ever had, and I was just so excited. So as I say, each year they took in 2 classes of 35 boys and 2 classes of 35 girls. So 1 year, there was essentially about 140 students. So when those 140 students had come at the end of 5 years, they took the school certificate exam, which was to allow you to leave if necessary and go to university. But out of that 140, when the exam results were seen, they allowed some students to opt for a further 2 years, which was intensive preparation for university. And if you graduated with what they call the higher school certificate at the end of that, you were exempt the first year of studies at the university. And out of the 140, the science group selected 7 students, 5 boys and 2 girls. And we were given classes, I say just 7 of us, in 4 subjects: mathematics, applied mathematics, physics, and chemistry. And I had actually been studying French because I was sometimes in the boys' school, sometimes in the girls' school, because I was studying French and German. And just as a side note, interestingly, there was no television at the time, but my German teacher said to me, said to the class, if you want to learn how to speak German, you should tune in to Radio Berlin, which we could do. You had the BBC and others, but you could tune in. Radio Berlin was in there, etc. And I heard Hitler giving his speeches, railing against what he called die Juden, the Jews. He was a very good speaker, but it was obvious that he had this horrible mentality. But anyway, we took I said, I want to continue in French. And they said, but you're the only student who's interested. I said, well, okay. They gave me a private tutor for 2 years. Now where else in education do you see something like that? He was an ex-British military officer who had been liaising with the French during the war. Wonderful time. So that was, I graduated with mathematics. So I had always wanted to join the Air Force because I had to do military, so-called national service after the war was over. I was graduating in 1947. The war ended in 45, but 44, 45. But I went to see the Air Force examiners to see which branch of the Air Force I was going to go into. And I had trained for 3 years. It's like an ROTC thing, but a high school ROTC rather than university as you have here. But the person who examined me looked at me and said, no, it was an Air Force officer, you've had, your eyesight's not good enough to be a pilot. And at the time, if you had to wear glasses, flying a plane was out of it, I think, because they felt if your glasses were damaged or something in an attack, you couldn't fly. He said, well, but he said, you've got a good background in physics, so we'll put you in as a radar mechanic. And I was furious. I said, I don't want to be a radar mechanic. He said, you have no option. You've got to do military service. So I walked out. My best friend was a fellow named Colin Belshaw. And Colin came from a military family. His brother had been involved in the Navy, taking supplies to the Russians through the Murmansk convoy. His other brother, Jack, was one of the first pilots to fly a Meteor jet, one of the first jet planes. But after the war, Jack, who was still in the military, was killed in a Meteor crash. And Colin was all set with me. He and I were going along to the Air Force. And he said, you know, I can't do this to my family. We've just lost Jack. They don't want to see me going to be another Air Force pilot. He said, so I've decided to go in the mines. I said, what do you mean? He said, oh, there's an option. You can spend your military service in the mines if you wish, because Britain depended on coal, and they also depended on food, because the supplies were cut off during the war. And so mining and agriculture were what they call reserved occupations, and you could go there instead of going into the forces. Well, the war was over, and so I said, that's interesting. It's only for 18 months, and I don't even have to go to any place. I can do it from home. Just go on my bike, come back. I said, maybe I can do that. So I went to the mining recruiter, and I said, I've just been told by the Air Force that I have to go to the Air Force. If you can change it so I can go into mines, I'm in. A week later, I got a request to report to the manager of the local coal mine. It's about 20 minutes ride on my bike. And it was the time all the mines had been nationalized. So they had introduced what they call a DPT scheme. They government, the national government, had said the mines had been allowed to deteriorate during the war because, and there were none of, when I got taken to the mines, it was one of 13 mines in the neighborhood. And of the 13, only one manager had a college degree. And he was a degree in chemistry from Oxford. And he was one of the most out-of-place managers I've seen. I don't know why he knew what I was. But this man that I was in, they'd all taken night school courses and qualified, as you would say here today, like professional engineers. But they didn't have college degrees. And the National Coal Board had decided to change that. They wanted everybody to have a college degree who could be a manager. You still had to have the underground experience. But so they were offering substantial fellowships to anybody who had graduated and qualified for university entrance to go into a mining program. But anyway, that came a little later. And when I thought I was going to this directed practical training program. But even the managers themselves of the mines weren't quite sure how it was all going to be organized. And they said, the manager was wondering what to do with me. And I remember him, his name was Mr. Clark. I went into his office and he said, "Oh, why are you here?" And I said, "Well, I've been told to come here." And he looked at my record and he said, "You've done physics?" And "Great," he said. "My ventilation engineer just told me he's going to quit." He said, and he's given me a month's notice. He said, "So, you go and work with him for a month, you're my ventilation engineer." And so I spent time, I became the ventilation engineer for the mine, but shortly afterwards I was taken by car to Manchester to the local headquarters of the NCB and inducted, if you like, into this DPT scheme. And they offered me a scholarship if I would take mining engineering. And so I enrolled at Sheffield University, and that's how I got into mining engineering.
So, Dad, knowing how you've reacted to all of our careers, I'd be interested to know what your parents thought of you going into the mining.
It's a very good question because some time ago, one of the presidents of AIME told me, or he actually wrote it in an article, I think, that he was at a meeting with about 500 or 600 or maybe even 1,000. It was an annual mining meeting. And they were talking about difficulty of recruiting young people into the mines. And he said to them, these were all mining engineers, "How many of you will recommend your children to go into mining?" And he said, in the 700 or so, only 2 hands went up. And he said, "That's something we really have to think about." Well, in my case, my mother felt that miners, with the exception of my father, were crude, rough, and not some people, decent people would associate with. And the point was she'd never come into contact with them, but she just heard stories. And even though she was not very wealthy at all, she had this feeling that she was several steps above them, with the exception of my father. So they had both, and my father, who, as I said, had worked from the age of 12 underground in mines. He was actually a contract miner helping my father dig the coal, and the more they got out, and my father was wheeling the tubs of coal as they got filled. He was a much slighter build than my father, and I think that long-term working underground in coal mines, which at the time were not very well maintained, contributed to his being in a hospital for several years when we were growing up. So both of them were delighted that I got to the high school and going to go on to university. But when they heard mining, my father they were quite happy. I said I was going to make a career in the Air Force as flying. They didn't mind that. But that was like a lead balloon. Boom. You know, my God, you're going to go into mines? And I remember saying to them, don't worry. Look, I'll do military service, but I can stay at home, and only 15 minutes ride away on my bike. Well, they didn't like it. But then, a little while later, they began to see that my career path in the mining might be a bit different than theirs, or their experience. And I was probably going to go up into management or something. So, bit by bit, they were mollified. As they saw my career developing, they changed their attitude somewhat. In fact, when I was offered the position at the University of Minnesota, my father came to the airport with me, and the last words he said to me was, I wish I was coming with you. So we were very close at the end. That was the last time I saw him, because he, about 12 months after I got, no, 6 months after I got here, he went into hospital and died. So I never saw him again. But let me now, perhaps,
So
that's as far as I go with that.
you were a boy in World War II. Can you tell us a little bit of your experiences?
Yes, I was, let's see, World War II broke out in 1939 for us in England. It was a bit before, it was the invasion of Germany invaded Poland, and the British had said that if that happened, they would declare war on Germany. And so that's when that happened. And Britain was alone in opposing, well, there was a war in Europe for a while, but it was in 1941 that the Germans started their bombing campaigns against Britain, particularly London. Now, London was not really a military target, but outside of London, the most heavily bombed city was Liverpool, because Liverpool was the main port. It was a real justifiable military target. It brought all of the food and military supplies that the British could get from wherever, especially to the United States, although there were a lot of boats sunk by U-boats in bringing that, but nevertheless, Liverpool was the big center. And it's only 12 miles from the center of Liverpool to where we were living. So it was in, I think, March 1941. By this time, we had moved from Crompton into Widnes, the northern part of the town. Not far from Crompton, but and there were quite a few bombing in March 1941. They called it the Liverpool Blitz. It was the height of it, and the bombs were that you could hear Spitfires and so on. And they had tracer bullets. Every once in a while, you could see where the bullets were flying in the air, and there were what we call balloon barrage up. Major balloons with a big steel cable attached to them. The idea being that if a plane hit those coming down, it would shear off the wing. But they were all around. And there were mobile anti-aircraft batteries. And the worst noise I've ever heard in the world was one of those mobile batteries firing just sort of halfway down the block from here. Awful. So as the war was going on in 1941, my father, who was working in the mines, This was after he recovered and he was back in full tilt. We'd moved from to witness. He worked at the mines during the day, and at night he was leader of what they call the rescue brigade. It was like the fire brigade, but the job was to get people out of bombed buildings. And actually, the miners were pretty good at knowing how to support things. So he was in that. So whenever there was an air raid warning, he had to go to be ready to help people. And so these raids occurred at night. And my mother was getting very worried that she was waking us all up in the night when an air raid would go, and we were too tired to go to school next day. So we had an air raid shelter, and she wasn't very comfortable, put a large bed in there and made us all sleep in there for the night, whether there was an air raid or not. She felt that was better. So, but I was 11 years old, 12. My brother was 10 or 9, and the other one about 8. And then my sister was 5 or 6. And my mother gave me the job of controlling the other children while the air raids were going on, because they thought, the 2 boys in particular, thought it was really exciting to hear and see all of this. So they'd run out of the air raid shelter, and there were pieces of shells, shrapnel it was called, fall on the ground. They'd hit the roof and bars off, and they wanted to collect pieces of shrapnel to go to school next day to trade them. If they got the bottom of a shell or things. And my job was to keep them in. Then one night, I remember, there was a German bomber, a Heinkel bomber, who was hit by a Spitfire, because they knew who hit it. And it was coming down, and it was coming right to, not far from where we were living. We could see it, and the machine guns exploding. And my brother Hugh was looking and said, "Oh my God, I've got to go and I've got to get a piece of a swastika." So he ran away and was trying to run to see where the plane would land, and it was going to, of course, explode. And I always remember that the plane, as it was coming down, the police obviously were running to try to prevent people from getting too close to it. But it went down inside a big fenced-off sports field for one of the local companies. And I thought to myself at the time, I bet the police are glad of that, because it stopped all of these people. Otherwise, the idiots would have run right up to the plane. So that was a big event. And I remember, I think there were a crew of 4. 2 were captured, they parachuted out, but 2 others died. The 2. And yeah, it was horrible. It was war, but these were human beings. And I was never forget that about 2 days later, the Royal Air Force gave a full military honours funeral to the 2 airmen, and they were buried in the local cemetery. And I even remember the name of one of them. It sounded non-German. It was Ludzinski. Sounded more Polish, but I don't know. But they were just young. He was 19. Well, he was the pilot, I don't know. But their graves were in the cemetery. And every day there were flowers on those graves. And at the end of the war, they located the families of the German families, and they were exhumed and taken back to Germany to be reburied. And it came out that there were 2 families of English families whose sons were in the Air Force. And they said, the mothers said, if anything happened to my boy, I would hope that somebody would take care of their grave. So they put flowers on the two graves. Humanity came out at the end. I've never forgotten that. So the war, there was another aspect of the war that was quite interesting. Everything was rationed, and there was very little. You got 1 egg a week, 1 ounce of butter, and so on. You had to go with a ration book, and when you were served, they crossed it off and so on, in your book. But my mother, who was a good cook and so on, but she could not get by with just 1 egg and so on to feed this family of 4. So she sent us out. I'm not sure if we all went, but I went as the oldest to put my little sister, the youngest, Betty. Betty was born in 1939. She's 10 years younger than I was, in a little sort of buggy. And she sent us out to the farms of the people that we'd known in Cronton. And we would go there and knock on the door. And now farmers, nobody knew, you know, how many eggs the hens had laid and so on. So it was a bit of a loose arrangement. They didn't get any ration books for eggs. They were told they could get chickens and so on. So we would go there, and I was 10, and my sister Betty was 18 months, no, I was probably 11, 18 months or so, sitting in this buggy looking a beautiful little smiling child. And we'd say, do you have any eggs or bacon or butter that you could let us buy? And we'd go from one farm to the other, all the way around. And when we came back, we'd probably have 12.5 eggs, a pound of butter, and so on. And my mother would then say, look at this, we're all right. But she loved tea, and she couldn't get enough tea, so she would trade butter for tea with other people who didn't like. And so it was quite a way, because we knew the farmers, you know. So, but at the same time, because my father was working in the mines, every month, this was a union, I think, had organized this, that every miner was given, free of charge, 1 ton of coal, because all the houses were heated by coal and so on. And so once a month, I would come home from school, and outside the front of the house was a big pile of coal. They just came and dumped it right on the side. And my father had given me instructions that if ever you see that, you know your job is to get a wheelbarrow and take it and put it in the place at the back. So my mother, however, we didn't need a ton of coal every month. She traded coal for tea, and it was amazing. It was not exactly, I remember my father got, because my mother loved tea, got a big pack of tea, a box about this big by this big, and he was going on the bus to bring it home. And it was up about this high, so he was sitting on it. And a policeman was riding back past him, and he just shouted, "It's obvious those are not eggs," because, you know, he wouldn't sit on the eggs. And my father just said, no, they're not eggs. I don't know where he got the tea from, but anyway, those were the sorts of things that went on. But my sister Betty was instrumental in getting us a large amount of those things. And then, as I say, my brothers and my father worked as the rescue brigade, but my mother also had to go and work. She did work at a big munitions factory just down 3 miles or so, filling shells with explosives. So she would go, and my job was to stay home and watch the kids. And I was always the one who had to help make dinner for her And I know she loved rice pudding, so I had to make rice. I became quite a cook. Yeah, so those are some of the things that happened during the war. And
So Betty rounded your family out to five. There are 5 children then.
yes, but Betty was, as I say, 10 years younger than I was. She's still the same smiling person, as you know.
So, Dad, can you tell us about your time at university?
Yes, as I told you, I was accepted to the University of Sheffield because it had a mining program. This high school that I came from felt that scientists, we should be going to Cambridge, and the arts people, Oxford, was where they should be directing attention. But Cambridge did not have a mining program. And so Sheffield was the nearest, and I applied, recognizing that I had the year in the mines to do, and had a very interesting exchange with the professor, Professor Statham, because he said that at the university they insisted that all entrants to the mining program had to spend 1 year in mines before they would be allowed to be admitted, so that they knew what mining was about. So to that extent, I fitted the bill. And when I got to Sheffield, it was really my first time away from home from much things. It was very different and very exciting. You were meeting students from all over the world, and it was very stimulating. But when it came to the mining program, I had some excellent colleagues there, some very good students. So I was a little disappointed with the undergraduate courses. They did not seem to build on the preparation we'd had in the high school. And so at one point I went into the head of the department and said, you know, some of this is a little dull. And we had an interesting chat. And I said, would you mind if I looked around and took some courses maybe in other departments? And particularly I was interested in electrical engineering, and I managed to find a course which was dealing with heavy electrical equipment. And I said, mines have hoisting equipment, you know, for going from the surface to the underground, and it was special designs, so-called Ward Leonard sets and so on. And so he said, no, okay. And so they allowed me to take some courses in other departments in place of what I felt were quite dull courses. And in the end, I did very well in the other courses too, and I ended up with a first-class honors degree, graduated on time. And at that point, there was a professor in the mining department named Dr. Robert Shepherd, who just joined there. He was one of the few people who had a PhD in the department. And he asked me if I would be, they were just starting to do graduate work. Remember now that the National Coal Board had taken over, and the National Coal Board really had a very different national perspective compared to the miners, who always, production was their thing for private owners. But, and they were in the process of establishing research facilities and so on and so forth around the country, and I could see myself perhaps joining one of those, but that's not what the courses were preparing me for. At any rate, I did well. I got a first-class honors program degree, and Dr. Shepherd said, would you be willing to keep going for a PhD? and the National Coal Board will extend your fellowship for the length of time it takes you to go to get the PhD. Because he said that they were looking at ideas that they'd found out in Germany, and they wanted to develop them in England. So they asked me to look at drilling of very hard rock. So I entered into that program. But once again, there were problems. It was a different kind of problem. And that problem was that they had no funds for research. And I was pretty much left on my own. And if I was going to study the breakage of hard rocks, I wanted to look at the breaking process, and I needed a high-speed camera, and I had to walk around and find another department that had one, and they were willing to loan me one. And then I had to get to measure the forces that were acting on the cutting tools, what they call a 3-component dynamometer. And I found out that the Royal Aircraft Establishment down in the south of England were willing to loan me one. And I was going around all the time trying to find things so that I could do the research. And I remember once I was trying to drill some hard rock, but I'd put gauges on the drill, and since it was rotating and I wanted to take an electrical signal off, I had what they call slip rings running on the rod in a bath of mercury. The mercury is what allowed you to rotate and still take an electrical signal off. So I designed and built my slip ring assembly, but I needed mercury. It was expensive. So I said, you know, to the lab technician, there's mercury in a lot of things around here. We've got barometers, and for mine ventilation, they had very precise inclined gauges to measure pressure differences and things. I said, why can't I use some of that? And the lab technician said to me, go and talk to the head of the department. He should buy you some mercury. I don't want to empty all the stuff out of these instruments and then put it back again later. And so I went in, and the head of the department professor said, tell Harry Barker, I want to see him. I want you to bring him in. And so he said, why don't you let him use that mercury from the instruments? And Harry said, why do we have to keep robbing Peter to pay Paul all the time? And he said, I understand, but Peter's not using it right now, so you go out and use it. So that was a sort of environment. They didn't understand that you had to have money and maybe assistance once in a while. One time I was lucky, I nearly broke my leg by a ram that got out of control and almost hit my leg. But, you know, so it was a very early stage they were doing. At any rate, I ended up getting my degree, PhD, and I now left the university and went back to continue my obligation for the time in the mines. And I'd been there just about, well, from July to about April. And I received a letter in the mail. It was from the University of Minnesota. And it was Professor Pfleider asking if I would be interested in coming to the University of Minnesota to start a 2-year postdoctoral program to develop the work I'd been doing in rock drilling, because I found out later that the iron mines of northern Minnesota were moving from what they call natural ore to taconite ore, and the taconite ore was much harder, and there were no commercial drills that were able to cut it. And the huge tool company had roller cone bits, but they were not. The bearings were failing. And so they developed what they called a jet piercer. And it was essentially doing what you do when you let the pan run dry on a stove. It was all a flame, and then behind the flame, a jet, actually a acetylene flame. Behind it, they put steam, and the rock was heated and then cooled rapidly. It broke. Anyway, so they wanted me to start to look at how to deal with that and get a different process.
So how did Pfleider know about you and your research?
Well, I later learned that because of the concern for drilling of the rock, Professor Pfleider had been organizing conferences in northern Minnesota to discuss the challenges of changing from natural iron ore to taconite ore. And he organized conferences on drilling and on blasting, because it was very hard rock. I think he was actually a man before his time, because he was really doing a lot of very, communicating to the companies, helping them, and so on. And apparently, my professor Shepard attended to give a talk at one of the drilling courses. And Pfleider said to him, I want to develop a research program here, Minnesota, and do you know anybody that might be able to help me? Well, he told of two people. First of all, he mentioned a Dr. Eyeight, who was working with the research department of the coal board. He already had finished his PhD and was in work there. And then he mentioned me as having just graduated and that I had worked on that topic. Well, apparently, they first approached Eyeight, and Eyeight decided he wanted to stay with where he was working in England. So Pfleider then wrote a letter to me saying they'd be interested if I would have take this position. Now, this caused me a bit of a problem, because the coal board, I was still under obligation to them, because they wanted me to work 1 year in the industry for every year that they supported me. So I said, how do I go and talk to them? Because I still had about 2 years left. I'd worked overall 4 years. So I went and talked to them and said, look, this could be a valuable aid to my education. I'll go and spend 2 years in the United States helping solve the problems, and then I'll come back and I'll continue then. Well, they were not very enthusiastic about that, but nevertheless, they eventually said, okay, you go for 2 years and come back. Well, that's how I came here. And as you know, I had not been here more than about 9 months, and I met your mother and decided we were going to get married. And it was kind of funny, because I mentioned Potts before. Potts was at the university I was here, and Pfleider was saying to him, try to, if you're here, why don't you take the two of them out to dinner? We'd like to encourage this to make sure that he maybe is interested in staying. So then I had to write to the National Coal Board and tell them they want me to stay and move forward. And I actually, and I think I'm one of the only few that did, asked the coal board, could I repay them for the unexpired time that I was obligated to work for them. And they were very, very nice. They said they understood it. They said a lot of students, several of those students, had decided to go and work in South Africa and the mines there because they were better paid and so on, and had not even talked to them. So I was and they ended up asking me for a very nominal amount, which I then paid, and I was free to stay in the United States. I had only been going on the drilling for a little while, and Professor Pfleider, who actually was a mover and shaker, he had been a prime mover in the establishment of the Rock Mechanics Symposium at Colorado School of Mines, because it was a joint venture of Colorado School of Mines and the University of Minnesota. And there was another person, Hartman, who was working, just got his PhD at Minnesota. He is listed as one of those working jointly on the first two symposia. But he finished a PhD and got offered a job as the head of mining at Penn State University. And so he left. And that's when they asked me for, would you mind teaching a couple of courses, one on ventilation and one on mine plant, it was called design. That was the hoists and all that sort of thing. So what I'd done in England came in handy, and he said, just do that for a year or so. So I did it, and then he came to me again. He said, look, I really would like to start a PhD program in rock mechanics. I've looked everywhere, and I can't find anybody to do it. I think I can find somebody to teach the other courses. Would you be willing? And I didn't let him finish the sentence. I said, absolutely, yes, I'll do it. Because I saw it was the opportunity for me to use the maths and so on and build on it. And so I started on rock mechanics. And all of the things I told you before about synergy, all those things started to happen at that time. Because I was asked to do that in, 1957. And other places started to get interested. And the people in South Africa started the rock mechanics program. Then somebody at Imperial College in London started, Everett Hook. But I still had one of the few in the United States that was pushing it. And so we developed that network of people, and it just blossomed from there on. As I told you, my first job was to try to get students for the PhD program. So I sent the note. I sent an announcement of what we're going to teach. And I was emphasizing that they were going to have to take courses, rigorous courses in mechanics and a lot of applied math, if you like, that had to be used. And the response I got from students around the United States was very poor. I said, well, what am I going to do now? And I said, well, we've put all this work in, why not just send it out internationally? And that produced a very interesting result, because I got application. The first PhD accident, it was from Egypt. We had some from Israel, Australia, well, just all over Germany and France and so on, and a number from the United States. We put that group together, and I said, well, they need this background in mechanics. Well, we had a very good mechanics department at the university. So I went to talk to the professors there. I said, would you be willing to let me have these students take your courses? And for a while they said, well, typically mining students and so on don't have the background that we need for our students. I said, yeah, but these are a special group. They're from Europe, not all from the United States. Some of them have very high preparation. Well, finally they agreed. And so I was allowed to, and I taught them the applications of what they learned there. And some of them had the background, others needed more, but they bonded as a group. And at the end, some of the professors in mechanics said to me, "We have never seen a group of students work so hard." Well, the rest is history. You can go through their names and see what they did. You know, eventually somebody like Mark Board, who's recognized as perhaps the best consulting mining engineer in the world, in the English-speaking world, certainly. You know, he's just retired now from, he was Director of Innovation at Hecla Mining Company. And he's developed a new mining method for them that's saving the company 50% on their costs. He's just going to publish a paper for it in mining engineering. So anyway, there were that caliber of people. The other thing is that they all became close friends. And you know, this one person coined the term, the Mafia, because they spread out. Anyway, that's how I started at Minnesota.